Koliko god si utvarali suprotno, na neka od najtemeljnijih pitanja nisu nađeni cjelokupni i sveobuhvatni odgovori. Jedan od takvih misterija jest kako je nastao život i kako se razvija. Kako sustavi uče i prosljeđuju nove informacije. Novi pristup tim pitanjima dao je britanski biolog Rupert Sheldrake još prije 30 godina u već klasičnoj knjizi Nova znanost o životu. Dobar dan.
Welcome. Come in.
Isprva osporavana, njegova teza o morfogenetskim poljima tijekom desetljeća privlačila je sve više pažnje. Kako zbog mogućnosti da dade odgovore na mehanizme kako sustavi uče i mijenjaju se, tako i zbog eksperimentalnih potvrda vezanih uz skrivene mehanizme morfogeneze. Svemir se pokazao daleko i inteligentnim nego što se smatra. Posvuda osim ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Zahvaljujemo vam što ste nas ugostili u svom domu radi ovog intervjua, koji je prije svega posvećen vašoj knjizi Nova znanost o životu. To je naslov knjige i pravo pitanje jest zašto mi uopće trebamo neku novu znanost o životu?
Well, because the old science of life, which is the mechanistic science of life, is inadequate to explain the phenomena of life. I first wrote this book in 1980. It was published in 1981. And at that time, most people thought that soon all the problems of biology would be solved by genes, genome sequencing, molecular biology, and the understanding of everything at a molecular level. I didn't think that. And since then, it's become very clear that that's simply not working. The new edition of the book, A New Science of Life, which has just come out, updates the whole thing. And I think the reasons for thinking we need a new science of life are stronger than ever before. First of all, the ability of genes to explain development, the development of form of plants and animals, which in the past, when we knew so little about genes, seemed persuasive, now seems less persuasive. The Human Genome Project has revealed that humans have only about 23,000 genes. Rice plants have about 38,000. Sea urchins have as many genes as we do. So there's no correlation between genes and form. And secondly, people thought that genes that switch patterns of development in fruit flies and mice and so on were key genes to explain the form of living organisms. It turns out these genes are almost the same in fruit flies and mice and humans. So if the developmental genes are the same, why do fruit flies and humans look different? There are many problems that are coming up. The more we discover, the more we realize we don't know. In the family, the big animal group that includes the whales, it also includes giraffes. And the genome of the whale and the giraffe is very similar, and yet you could hardly think of animals more different. So clearly the form of the animal and the behavior of the animal is not adequately explained by the genes. So what is it explained by? Well, it can't, if it's not in the genes, where is it? What is it that causes organisms to develop the way they do? Why is a pine tree different from an oak tree? Why is a giraffe different from a whale? These are very, very big problems in biology, and they're not solved by the existing mechanistic molecular approach. That's why I think we need a new science of life. And there's simply too much that existing biology doesn't and cannot explain. 30 years ago, it was reasonable to hope that more details of molecules would explain it. Now, I think it's completely hopeless. It's, I think, become more and more obvious we need a completely new approach.
U knjizi Nova znanost o životu koristite pojam morfogenetička polja. Što su ona, što rade i na kakav način prema vašim saznanjima?
The idea of morphogenetic fields was first put forward in 1920 by Alexander Gervich, who was working in Leningrad. It's not my idea. It's an idea which has been there in biology for a long time. And the reason he put the idea forward is the same reason we still need it. How do you explain the forms of plants and animals when the genes in all the cells are the same? Gervich was studying mushrooms, the growth of mushrooms. And when a mushroom grows, the fungal hyphae, the threads of fungi that grow through the soil, come together and they grow together and they form this complex form of the mushroom. Separate threads which have been growing separately somehow know how to join together and form a complicated form like an ordinary mushroom. How do they do it? Well, they somehow behave in relation to the other ones as if they know where their position should be. And Gervich thought this was very like a field phenomenon. In a magnetic field, the iron filings take up particular forms because there is a field that contains all the different particles of iron within the field. It gives them a shape or structure. And he thought that living organisms might have fields that gave them their shape, like an invisible plan of the organism. We know that the fields of nature in magnetism, electricity and gravitation are invisible structures which give form to things. The Earth is round because of the gravitational field, and so is the sun, and so is the moon. The field of iron, the lines of force around a magnet are created by the field which is in the magnet and around it. And Gervich proposed that within the developing mushroom and around it there was a field which shaped what happened. A similar idea was put forward in Vienna by Paul Weiss in 1921. He was an animal embryologist. And he argued that in a developing embryo, there is a field for the whole embryo, and then there's a field for the limbs, the arms and the legs, a field for the eye, a field for the liver, a field for the kidney. These different organs have their own fields, and within those that are the tissues, they have fields too. So there's a nested hierarchy of fields within fields within fields. He also called these morphogenetic fields. Morphogenesis means the coming into being of form. Morphe means form, genesis means coming into being. So morphogenetic fields are fields that give rise to form. They're like invisible plans. If you think about it, the form of an organism can't be explained just in terms of genes and proteins. My arm and my leg have exactly the same genes. They have exactly the same proteins, the same muscle proteins, the same nerve proteins, and so on. Yet the shape is different. It's like buildings. You can go along a street and you can see two buildings that look completely different, yet they contain the same bricks and cement and timber. The materials can be the same, but the shape can be different. And the genes enable us to understand the materials in an organism, the proteins that they can make, the chemicals that they contain. But they don't explain the form the organism takes up. That's what the morphogenetic field does. So by the end of the 1920s, many biologists concluded that fields of this kind were organizing plants and animals. This is still a mainstream concept in biology. In developmental biology, they're sometimes referred to as developmental modules. Development is modular. Either you get a leaf or you get a petal in a plant, or you get a stem or you get a root. You can have mutations that distort the form of the leaves and the petals. You can have mutations that switch petals into leaves or leaves into petals. But basically there's a module of development, and that is the result of the morphogenetic field of a leaf or of a petal. So the question is, what are these fields? When I was doing research in Cambridge in developmental biology, studying the growth of plants, I came to the conclusion that chemicals alone can't explain form. We need fields, we need morphogenetic fields. Many other developmental biologists have come to the same conclusion. So the question that I was addressing is, what are these fields? And there are three opinions about the nature of morphogenetic fields. The first is the conventional one, and many biologists think this. They say, well, we need the concept of a field, but the field can be explained in terms of ordinary physics and chemistry. It's nothing but the diffusion of a hormone through a tissue, or a diffusion gradient, or perhaps an electric gradient. It's explainable in terms of ordinary physics and chemistry. That's a very common view, the majority view within mechanistic biology. The second approach comes from mathematicians. Many mathematicians have turned to biology to try and model biological processes mathematically. Most mathematicians are secret or explicit Platonists. They think that the ultimate reality is mathematical, and that if only we can find out the mathematical equations underlying a giraffe or a whale, then we'll have explained it. The trouble with mathematics and Platonic mathematics is that it's eternal. It exists outside time. So an eternal equation existing in a kind of mathematical mind outside space and time, which is how mathematicians often think of these equations, doesn't account for evolution. Biology has history within it. Evolution involves the inheritance of form and behavior, which depends on what's happened before. And my view is that mathematical approaches to morphogenesis can only produce models of morphogenetic fields or of morphogenesis itself, but they don't explain it. I think mathematical models are produced by humans, they exist in human minds, and they don't explain anything, they just model it. So the problem that I'm addressing is, how do these fields get inherited? I think that they're real fields, they're not just ordinary physics and chemistry. That would explain nothing. It would just put us back into saying we don't know, because nobody knows how development occurs. I think they're a new kind of field in nature, and I think they have properties that include their history. So my theory of morphogenetic fields is based on what I call morphic resonance, which is that these fields have a kind of inherent memory. The field of the giraffe is shaped by the actual form of previous giraffes. Each individual in a species tunes into a collective memory of all the past individuals in the species. It in turn contributes to this collective memory. So the morphogenetic field of a giraffe is a kind of memory of previous giraffe forms. The morphogenetic field of an oak tree is a memory of previous oak tree forms. And this resonance occurs across space and time. It's not inherited through the genes, it's inherited directly through resonance with past members of the species. In animals, the instincts of animals are like habits of the species inherited by morphic resonance. So what I'm saying is that morphogenetic fields that organize form and behavioral fields that organize behavior are inherited by morphic resonance, not through the genes. The genes create the right chemicals, the right conditions for the form and the behavior, but they don't explain it, any more than the building materials in a house explain the form of the house. You need the building materials to make a house, but the plan of the house is not in the bricks and in the cement. And I don't think that the plan of a giraffe or the instincts of a whale are in the DNA. So basically that's my hypothesis, and it's very controversial because it proposes there's a new kind of causation working across time. It's not just encoded in the chemical genes.
Knjiga Nova znanost o životu bavi se hipotezom o takozvanim formativnim uzročnostima. One zapravo govore da priroda na neki način se oblikuje prema svojim navikama i običajima, a da nije vođena nekim vanjskim zakonima. Možete li objasniti razliku između ta dva gledišta?
Well, the idea that nature is governed by eternal laws is the standard scientific assumption. Most scientists assume, without thinking about it, that all the laws of nature, the laws of electromagnetism, gravity, quantum theory, and so on, were all present at the moment of the Big Bang. The usual assumption is that at the moment of the Big Bang, all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it appeared from nowhere in an instant. That's the standard scientific theory. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the laws of nature and all the matter and energy in the universe from nothing in a single instant. The idea of eternal laws of nature is a hangover from the old cosmology before 1966. The Big Bang theory became the standard view in science in 1966. Before that, most physicists thought that the universe was eternal, made up of eternal matter, eternal energy, and governed by eternal laws of nature. This is the Platonic tendency so strong in science, right from the 17th century when modern science began. The founders of modern science, like Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, all believed that God was a mathematician and that he created the world machine in accordance with eternal mathematical laws, which were ideas in the mind of God. So that idea has become so habitual among scientists that it's usually taken for granted. Before 1966, in an eternal universe, eternal laws made sense. After 1966, with the Big Bang theory, where the universe came into being 14 billion years ago, then what about the eternal laws? If they're really eternal, they must have existed before the universe in a non-physical, metaphysical state, in other words, a Platonic realm. If they came into being with the universe, then how do we know they all came into being fully formed? In a radically evolutionary universe, why shouldn't the laws of nature evolve? And as soon as you think about it, you realize the very concept of laws of nature is a metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized humans have laws. Tribes have customs. So this is extrapolating, a very anthropomorphic metaphor, extrapolating the idea of human laws onto the whole of nature. In the 17th century, in mechanistic theology, this made sense. God was the cosmic emperor. He made up these eternal mathematical laws. And he was also the cosmic police force who made sure that everything obeyed the laws because he was omnipotent. This made sense to the founding fathers of modern science. But actually, if you look at the law metaphor, you realize that human laws do evolve. The laws of Britain today or the laws of Croatia today are different from the laws 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Laws evolve. So in an evolving universe, why shouldn't the laws evolve? But the very concept of law is itself flawed as a metaphor. I think a much better concept is habit. Habits exist in humans, they exist in dogs and cats and other animals. I think habits are much more universal in nature than laws. And my idea in its simplest form is saying that the universe is governed by evolving habits, not by eternal laws. These evolving habits depend on a memory within nature that depends on morphic resonance. This memory in living organisms plays a major part in the inheritance of form and behavior, but it also applies to crystals. If you make a new chemical compound for the first time, then the first time you try to crystallize it, there won't be a pre-existing form, lattice structure for that crystal. A new form comes into being in nature. It often takes a very long time to make the first crystals of a new compound. Chemists often wait months or even years before they can form a crystal. Once it's formed in one place, then it can form more easily anywhere else in the world. This is well known to chemists. New compounds become easier to crystallize as time goes on. I think this is because of morphic resonance, applying even in the realm of crystals and in physical phenomena as well. So I think that habits pervade nature at all levels, even in chemistry and physics, not just in biology. The assumption of eternal laws, which most scientists make, is a kind of habit of thinking itself, which is a carryover from an old cosmology. When you talk to chemists and they show you the periodic table of the elements, they treat it as if this is some kind of Platonic form, of all the possible elements with no history. But actually, in the Big Bang, there were no chemical elements, there were no atoms. Every chemical element has evolved in time. Once there were no zinc atoms in the universe, once there were no lead atoms, once there were no lithium atoms. All these atoms have evolved and have a history. So even in chemistry, there's a kind of history and habits. In physics and chemistry, most phenomena, like the behavior of hydrogen atoms, the crystallization of sodium chloride, and so on, have been going on for billions of years. So the habits are very, very deep-seated. They're in deep grooves. We don't actually see any change in the way these things happen because the habits are so fixed. But when we look at new phenomena, like the formation of new crystals or a new form of behavior in animals, then we can actually see the habits build up. And this is where the hypothesis of formative causation through morphic resonance becomes testable experimentally.
Nije toliko poznato da se zapravo tijekom 20. stoljeća nagomilala velika količina dokaza o nasljeđivanju i prosljeđivanju stečenih karakteristika. O kojim se dokazima u stvari radi?
Well, the inheritance of acquired characteristics is the idea that animals and plants can inherit features that their ancestors acquired. This theory was first put forward by Lamarck in France in 1800. It's so-called Lamarckian evolution. Lamarck said that animals acquire new habits, and these habits are inherited by their descendants, and so there's an inheritance of habits. Now, it's very similar to what I'm saying. Charles Darwin, was a Lamarckian, not because he was particularly following Lamarck, but because in the 19th century it was taken for granted that habits are inherited. Darwin strongly believed in the inheritance of habits. In the 20th century, there was a very deep controversy on this subject. In the West, the inheritance of acquired characters was treated as heresy, and scientists who supported it were persecuted. Kammerer, the Austrian biologist, was severely persecuted and ended up by committing suicide because he supported this highly controversial theory. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the inheritance of acquired characteristics was the mainstream orthodoxy of biology under Maturin and Lysenko. And Mendelian geneticists were persecuted, and some were sent to Siberia or died. They were executed by the KGB. So this became an intensely polarized, not just in science, but in politics. And in the Cold War, the two sides in the Cold War had different theories of inheritance. In the West, there was a total denial of the inheritance of acquired characters, but nevertheless, there was a lot of evidence it really happened. Since the year 2000, this taboo has been lifted. The evidence has become overwhelming that this really happens. It's now called epigenetic inheritance. And what was once taboo has now become mainstream. So it's no longer controversial to suggest that acquired characteristics are inherited. For example, studies in human genetics and inheritance have shown that in Sweden, where there was a famine in the 19th century, the grandchildren of men who survived this famine have different characteristics. They grow less, they're less prone to diabetes than the grandchildren of men who weren't involved in the famine. And there are many examples now in animals and plants of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. I think part of this epigenetic inheritance is due to changes in the way genes are expressed. This is the orthodox theory of it. Some of it depends not on changing the genes, but on changing the methylation of the DNA, changing the underlying genes remain the same, but the way they're packaged changes. The proteins that sit on the DNA and the chromosomes may be modified. And these modifications can be inherited in some cases, so that organisms can inherit the same genes as their parents, but they inherit them as being switched off or switched on. And so that's one kind of epigenetic inheritance. Another kind of epigenetic inheritance depends on morphic resonance. And this is where the hypothesis of formative causation is testable scientifically. For example, if you train rats to learn a new trick at Harvard in the United States, like escaping from a water maze, they have to swim to get out of a maze, then rats in Scotland and in Australia should be able to learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it in Australia. In America, they don't need to have genes from those rats, they don't need to meet the rats, they don't need to communicate with them. Just because they're the same kinds of rats in the same kind of situation, by morphic resonance they'll learn the same thing quicker. Now, surprisingly, there's already evidence that that actually happens. There was a long series of experiments lasting more than 20 years in Harvard, Edinburgh University and Melbourne University, Australia, that showed exactly this kind of improvement in learning in rats. This was a big effect, I mean, more than 10 times quicker. And the experiments in Australia showed that this was not just a transmission of the ability to learn from parents to their children. All the rats of that breed were getting better, even if their parents had never been trained. So there's already evidence that this phenomenon occurs. And similarly, in Russia, Pavlov, the great physiologist, did experiments with mice, where he trained mice to respond to a bell and run to a particular place to get food, a classic conditioned reflex experiment. He found their children learned twice as fast, and their children, the grandchildren, learned 4 times as fast. That there was a tremendous increase in the rate of learning that involved an inheritance of acquired characters. So there's evidence from experiments with animal behavior and also in experiments with animal development that suggest that morphic resonance may indeed be taking place and playing an important part in inheritance. I mean, we need more evidence, but there's already some evidence that this is really happening.
Do sada smo čuli primjere iz onog područja koje obično zovemo životom, znači reći o biljkama, životinjama i slično. No, koliko se dublje odmiče u razmišljanju o prirodi stvarnosti, toliko se vidi da je teško naći pravu granicu između života i neživota. Pomalo u prilog tome da i takozvani neživi sustavi prema našoj današnjoj terminologiji uče je činjenica da su tijekom 20. stoljeća određene točke taljenja, točke na kojima neka tvar isparava, rasle. Zbog čega je to važno i što se uopće pokazalo u vašim istraživanjima u promjenama tih točaka taljenja?
Well, in the structure of crystals, I'm suggesting morphic resonance plays a part. It becomes easier to crystallize things the more often they've been crystallized. But the morphic resonance means that the structure of the crystal becomes more habitual and therefore more stable. This theory therefore predicts that if you crystallize things repeatedly, if you make them very often, the structure of the crystal becomes more stable. That means it's harder to break it up. And the way you break up a crystal is by heating it. When it reaches a certain temperature, the crystal structure dissolves, and that's the melting point. This theory predicts that if you make new chemicals for the first time, the melting point will be lower than if you make them very, very often, if you've made a lot of a compound, because that means the crystals become more stable, so the melting point should increase. Now, when I first thought of this, I thought this can't be true. I studied chemistry as a student, and like everyone else who studied science, I thought melting points must be fixed, because everybody believes they're fixed. And if you look up melting points in a library, in a laboratory, they list them in things called handbooks of physical constants. I mean, it must be constant. It says so on the cover of the book. So it was a long time before I actually thought, well, perhaps they really do change. And I started asking chemist friends about this. And I said, have you ever noticed that new compounds have melting points that increase? And to my surprise, almost all of them said, well, yes. And so then I said, well, how do you explain that? And they thought for a little bit, because they weren't used to thinking about this. And they always come up with the same answer, which is not unreasonable. What they say is, well, we know that impurities lower the melting point, And that's true. That's why you put salt on ice to make it melt in the winter. Impurities lower the melting point. As time goes on, chemists get better at making these compounds. Therefore, as time goes on, the samples they make are purer. Therefore, the melting points go up because they're purer. I said, but how can you be sure that these later ones are actually purer? They said, well, they must be purer because the melting points are going up. So he said, it's not unreasonable, but it's a circular argument, you see. So I decided to try and compare melting points by comparing similar compounds that crystallize in nature, that have crystallized in nature for millions of years, where you'd expect the melting point to increase and reach some asymptotic limit, so that after a while you wouldn't see any further increase. When you've got billions of past crystals, you wouldn't notice any further change. It's like a fixed habit after a while. Compare compounds that have crystallized in nature for millions of years with ones that didn't exist until humans made them in laboratories in the last 150 years. So I got a series of pairs of chemicals and looked at the history of their melting point. For example, salicin is a compound that occurs in willow bark. It's been used in herbal remedies for fever for centuries. But this crystallizes spontaneously in dried bark. And the melting point of salicin hasn't changed for the last 100 years. It's been exactly the same. But aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, is a synthetic derivative of salicin that didn't exist till German chemists made it in the late 19th century. And it's now used on a huge scale. It's one of the most popular drugs, aspirin. And the melting point of aspirin, since about 1910, has increased by about 10 degrees centigrade. Now, I haven't got the data. I would expect it might have increased quite a lot between 1870 and 1910, but I haven't got the detailed data on melting points earlier. I've found many other examples where newly synthesized compounds have increased melting points of 10, 20 degrees, some cases 30 degrees. We're talking big effects, not fractions of a degree. We're talking large changes in degrees centigrade. Now, the problem with historical data is we don't know the purity of these compounds. The data are not very good on purity. In these handbooks, they give you the melting points, and in the published papers, they give you the melting points, but not the exact purity. So the best way to test this would be to do a new experiment. And the new experiment would work as follows. You take 10 newly synthesized compounds in a laboratory in, say, London, and then these are ones where there have been very few crystals. Then in New York, you select one of these 10 at random, crystallize large kilogram quantities of it, and then the people in London would take the 10 samples out of the deep freeze, measure their melting points, without knowing which one had been selected in New York. My prediction is that the one they'd worked on in New York would now have an increased melting point and the others wouldn't. And then that could be repeated with another sample. This would be a wonderful way of actually testing the theory. You could even transmit information that way. Say that sample 5 was selected in New York and that went up in London, and the next month sample 2, and the next month sample 7, and the next month sample 6. That would give you a 4-digit PIN code, which you could use for actually getting money out of a cash machine. You could do this experiment in such a way that you could show that you could transmit this information in sequence without wires, transistors, and so forth. The morphic resonance transfer of information would be completely different from anything we have at the moment in our present information transfer systems. And indeed, it could give rise to an entirely new kind of technology, a new kind of communication technology.
Spomenuli ste moguće eksperimentalne testove postojanja morfogenetskih polja u području kemije i biologije. Ima ih još dosta koje niste spomenuli. Uz točke taljenja i tu transformaciju kristala možemo spominjati prilagodbe kod staničnih kultura. toleranciju na toplinu kod biljaka i slično. Sve se to može na jedan sličan način mjeriti kroz promjene koje možda se stiču i prenose. Posebno priča je kako takve iste principe primjenjivati kod ljudske psihologije i ljudske svijesti. Postoje li tu neki mjerljivi fizički efekti? Naime, osim knjige New Science of Life napisali ste knjige 7 eksperimenata koji mogu promijeniti svijet, pa onda psi koji znaju kad se njihovi vlasnici vraćaju kući, pa onda osjećaj da ste gledani, dakle osjećaj kad ljudi znaju da ih netko gleda. Čime ste se ukratko bavili u tim knjigama i koji su zaključci?
Well, in some of my other books, I'm dealing with the ways that members of social groups are interconnected. A morphic field, the morphogenetic field shapes developing organisms, behavioral fields shape behavior, but fields of social groups like flocks of birds, like starlings, or schools of fish, are also fields that are shaped by morphic resonance. The generic name for all these kinds of fields is morphic field. Morphogenetic fields is like a species in the genus morphic field. Social fields, the fields of social groups, are also morphic fields. So the reason that flocks of birds like starlings can turn at almost the same time without bumping into each other is because I think they're all within a field of the group. It's not just a matter of looking at their neighbours and adjusting what they do. It happens too fast to be explained that way. The best computer models treat it as a field phenomenon. So I think that social groups are linked through fields. Now, if you take a social group like a pack of wolves, they all interact with each other and they're bonded with each other. If some of them go away from the others, like adult wolves go hunting to bring food back to the cubs which are in the den, I'm suggesting that the social field that links them is not broken when the adult wolves go away, and they may go away 20, 50, 100 kilometres. The field is stretched. And because they're still linked through this morphic field, a change in one can affect the other. And I think this is the basis of telepathy. It's similar it's analogous to quantum non-locality. In quantum theory, if particles have been part of the same system and they move apart, a change in one can affect the other. Einstein hated quantum theory for that reason. He said it allows for what he called a spooky action at a distance. But quantum theory really does allow for this, which is now the basis of quantum cryptography and some aspects of quantum computing. I'm not saying that with animals it's the same as quantum theory, but it's certainly analogous, and this effect does not fall off with distance in quantum theory or in telepathy. So I'm suggesting that this subject of telepathy, which, as everybody who's scientifically educated knows, is a completely taboo subject within science. It's one of the things that you're not supposed to believe if you're a scientist, because there's been a deep-seated taboo against it. Not based on evidence, but really a kind of prejudice, because it's considered unscientific. I think it's very scientific. I think it's normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. I think it's a normal way in which animals communicate at a distance. So I've done a lot of research on telepathy in animals, and I started by looking at dogs, because they're the animals we know best, and cats. And I found that many people who keep dogs have noticed that these animals pick up their thoughts or intentions telepathically, or seemingly telepathically. The same with cats and other domestic animals like parrots and horses. Now, again, anyone who's had a scientific education knows that they've got to dismiss this. So they say, oh, well, they're just reading body language, it's subtle cues, it's the sense of smell, and so forth. But I looked at phenomena which are not so easily explained. Many dogs know when their owners are coming home, and they go and wait at a door or window when the person is still 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour away from home. This happens even when people come at non-routine times. It all happens when people at home don't know when they're coming. It even happens when they're travelling by train or bus or plane, not by a familiar car. So how do you explain this? Well, the usual explanation of scientific so-called skeptics is to say, well, it's just smell, or they can smell them from many miles away, many kilometres away. Well, I decided to test this, and I've done a whole series of experiments where we film the place the dog waits. So we've got a complete record of what it's doing when the owner's away from home. We have the time code on the film, so you can see exactly what happens. And then we have the owner go at least 8 kilometres away from their home. They come home at randomly chosen times. We tell them by mobile telephone when to come home. They don't know in advance. We pick random times. To avoid familiar car sounds, they come in unfamiliar vehicles or taxis. And the people at home don't know when they're coming, and sometimes there are no people at home. And what we find is that these dogs go and start waiting when the person forms the intention to come home, even before they've got into the taxi. And this happens over and over again. So I think what this is showing is that the animals are responding to the person's intention. It's a telepathic response. This can easily be replicated. It has been replicated, even by skeptics. The evidence is summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and in my published papers in peer-reviewed journals. So this is one example of telepathy. In the human realm, the commonest kind that happens in the modern world is in connection with telephone calls. More than 80% of people have had the experience of thinking of someone for no apparent reason. Then the phone rings, they pick it up, they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." 80% or more of the population have had that experience. Again, anyone who's had a scientific education knows that they're not meant to think it's telepathy, so they always say, well, that doesn't prove telepathy. You think about people all the time. If one of them rings up, you then imagine it might be telepathy and you just forget the millions of times you're wrong. Well, that's a hypothesis, but there's no evidence for it, so I decided to test it. And in my experiments on telephone telepathy, how they work is that we find people who say this happens to them quite often. We film them sitting at home with a landline telephone, no caller ID. They give the names of 4 people they know well, friends or family members. We then pick one of those 4 at random. We ring them up and ask them to phone the subject. So the person's sitting there, the phone rings. They know it's one of these 4 people. They can't guess which one because it's picked at random. Even if they know that person's habits, they can't guess who it is this time because it's a randomly selected choice made by the experimenter. Before they pick the phone up, they have to guess who it is. I think it's Mary, so they pick it up, "Hello, Mary." They're right or they're wrong. Now, if they were just guessing, if it was just coincidence, they'd be right 1 time in 4, 25% of the time. In fact, in these experiments, in hundreds of trials, the average score's 45%. The probability of this being a chance effect is huge. It's less than 1 in a billion. This is more significant than the existence of the Higgs boson in terms of statistics. And these experiments have now been replicated in other laboratories, by other universities. So I think the evidence for telepathy is actually quite good. The problem is not the evidence for it. It's not even the rareness is common. Most people have experienced it. The problem is a scientific taboo that comes from a materialistic, mechanistic way of thinking that prohibited this and says we shouldn't look at this evidence. It's not allowed. That is a problem, a dogmatic problem of science. One of the problems of science, which I show in my latest book, The Science Delusion, is that it's too hemmed in, constricted by dogmas. If we question the dogmas, turn them into scientific questions, science opens up in a completely new way, which I think would lead to a scientific renaissance. Many questions at present taboo would become valid scientific questions. And as in the case of telepathy, exciting new possibilities would emerge, which are completely scientific. You can do experiments, you can do statistics, you can publish them in scientific journals, which I have done. You can replicate them. This is real science. But it extends science into areas which have been prohibited from science by these taboos for decades.
Čuli smo sad velik broj tvrdih podataka da doista na neki način morfička ta rezonancija postoji među stvarima, da sustavi uče, da kristali uče, da se svemir cijelo vrijeme mijenja. Velika količina znanstvenih podataka doista govori o tome u prilog. No u konačnici možda je trenutak da se malo uzdignemo od tvrdih podataka i pogledamo što se doista događa kad pogledamo širu sliku i što ti podaci doista nama govore o svemiru, znači o granicama između živog i neživog, znači imamo sustave koji uče, ponavljaju, razvijaju se. Svi ovi podaci istraživanja, koji oni zapravo imaju značaj za naš temeljni pogled na život?
I think the major shift in worldview that's happening now is the shift from the view of the universe as a machine. In the 17th century, people thought it was like clockwork. Their metaphors were just mechanical. We still have this dominance of mechanical metaphors in science. The universe is mechanical. The brain is a computer, the eye's like a camera, the heart's a pump. These mechanical metaphors have dominated science since the 17th century. And they help us, and they're quite productive. I mean, the big successes of science are successes of mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, computers, telephones, the internet, and so on. But what modern science is showing us is that the universe is not really mechanical, it's not really a machine. That certain aspects are a bit machine-like, but to say that one-size-fits-all metaphor of the machine is good for the universe, it's not. Science has outgrown this mechanical metaphor. Since the Big Bang theory, the whole universe doesn't look anything like a machine. The Big Bang is like the hatching of the cosmic egg. The universe is now like a gigantic developing organism, growing, cooling, and as it grows and cools, new structures and forms appear within it. This is much more like the way an embryo or a plant grows than like any machine that we've ever thought of, clockwork or computer. And the idea of habits of nature instead of laws is again part of this organic view of nature. I think what this is showing us is that the universe is a developing organism. Evolution is part of this development. We are part of a vast, evolving cosmos. We're within the organism of the universe, and we're within the organism of the solar system. The solar system's a kind of organism. The galaxy is an organism with their own life, possibly even with their own minds. One of the problems of materialist science is that it can't explain consciousness because it says everything's matter and matter's unconscious. That means that the very existence of human minds or any other minds is problematic. In fact, many materialists try to deny that minds exist. I mean, it's an absurd proposition. I mean, to deny it, you have to have a mind. To put forward the arguments, you have to have reason. You appeal to evidence. Yet, if our minds are nothing but the unconscious operation of computing mechanisms inside our brains that are just unconscious physics and chemistry, the materialist beliefs must be nothing but the product of blind physics and chemistry. And why should we believe something that they have to say because their brain makes them do it? It's self-contradictory. It's basically absurd. If we admit the existence of human consciousness and minds in animals, which I think we have to, then shouldn't minds possibly be found elsewhere in the universe? What if the sun is conscious? What if the sun has a mind? It's not just a body, but it has a mind as well. It may think. And what if the entire galaxy has a mind? So I think that we live in a living universe where within a vastly greater organism, the whole universe, we're within the organism of the whole galaxy, within the organism of the solar system, within the organism of the Earth, Gaia, living at all these levels. So instead of being separate beings with mechanical minds separated inside brains, we're living interconnected with each other, with the environment, with the Earth, with the solar system, the galaxy, and the entire cosmos. So I think this is a very profound shift in worldview, and it's one which is something which I think would be much more healthy. It's extremely alienating to believe that we live in an unconscious universe that has no purpose whatever, that our minds are separated inside our own brains and are nothing but the physics and chemistry of our mental computers, genetically programmed computers. Extremely alienating view, and one that leads to a terrible disharmony between people and nature, and people and other people. I mean, the modern world shows this disharmony in every way, including the ecological crisis. So I think that it would have a healing effect on humans and on society to return to what I think is a much more realistic and more truly scientific view of the world as a living organism.